Good evening and welcome. I'm Deborah Crone, Professor and Chair of Academic Programs here at BGC, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Meredith Martin, this year's winner of the Iris Foundation Award for Outstanding Mid-Career Scholar. Yay. The award will be formally presented tomorrow at our annual Iris Awards lunch with this year's other distinguished honorees, some of whom are here. Welcome. The Outstanding Mid-Career Scholar Award is traditionally selected by the BGC faculty for important contributions to the field of decorative arts, design history, and material culture studies. Meredith Martin joins previous winners, including Wayne Modeste, Anne Lafont, Sanchita Balachandran, Evelyn Welch, Giorgio Riello, Finbar Barry Flood, John Stiles, Glenn Adamson, Elisa Lagama, and many others. Here at Bard Graduate Center, we study the human past and cultural history through their material traces and the complex ways in which decorative arts, design, and material culture mediate our own relationships with the past. Our students, faculty, and staff and research fellows do this work cognizant of our own location in time and space. We're situated in 3 landmark buildings on the Upper West Side, in the heart of Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral territories of the Lenni Lenape, 1 block away from the former site of Seneca Village, a community of African American and immigrant property owners who were forcibly relocated to create Central Park. We're in a city long comprised of global migrants and refugees from war, violence, and economic dislocation. Our speaker tonight is Professor of Art History at New York University and the Institute of Fine Arts and a founding editor of Journal 18, an innovative and genre-bending online journal that has raised the bar for creative scholarship on the 18th century. Meredith received her PhD from Harvard and her BA from Princeton. A specialist in early modern French art and empire, she's the co-author with Gillian Weiss of The Sun King at Sea, Maritime Art and Galley Slavery in Louis XIV's France, published by the Getty in 2022, which carried away 3 prestigious awards: the Leo Gershoy Prize from the American Historical Association, the David F. Pinkney Prize from the Society for French Historical Studies, and the Kensher Prize from the Center for 18th Century Studies. The French edition, Le Roi Soleil à la Mer, was published in 2022, and she and Dr. Weiss are organizing a related exhibition that will open at the Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris in spring of 2026. Meredith's first book, Dairy Queens, The Politics of Pastoral Architecture from Catherine de' Medici to Marie Antoinette, and one of the greatest book titles ever, I have to say, was published by Harvard in 2011. She's also a co-author of Meltdown, Picturing the World's First Bubble Economy, which is related to an exhibition she co-curated for the New York Public Library that looks at the 1720 economic meltdown through a range of prints and ephemera. Together with Phil Chan, Meredith reimagined and restaged a lost French ballet from 1739 known as the Ballet des Porcelaines, which premiered at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in December 2023 and was performed to great critical acclaim and audience delight throughout the US and Europe in 2022. Beautifully costumed and choreographed, the obscure 18th century text literally sprang to life across the stage in this phenomenally beautiful and creative project. She's currently working on another multimedia project that explores the links between Haiti, Saint-Domingue, and the Paris art world during the 18th century, and you'll hear more about that tonight. As a scholar of 18th century decorative arts, Meredith has consistently pushed the boundaries of the field, both literally expanding the geographic range of the canon and conceptually by framing the discourse in light of unexplored juxtapositions. A few titles of her articles and book chapters will help make this clear. Once Upon a Time at the Château de Morville, Commerce, Colonialism, and Chinoiserie in the Ballet des Porcelaines, published in conjunction with the Ballet Project. Another, Left Bank, Right Bank, 2 Views of the Indies in Paris, published in Journal 18 in 2021, and Enslaved Muslims at the Sun King's Court, also co-authored with Gillian Weiss in 2020. On a more personal note, Professor Martin is a longtime friend of the BGC, and we are fortunate to share students, lectures, study days, openings, and other extracurricular activities with Meredith, whose generosity, creativity, humility, and sense of humor help to cement the community, enhancing her very impressive scholarly contributions. Once again, I'm delighted to welcome Meredith to the podium this evening for what promises to be a surprising, enjoyable, and out of the box lecture.
Thank you, Deborah, for the very generous introduction. Thank you so much to the Iris Foundation for this amazing honor. I'm a huge fan, longtime fan of the Bard Graduate Center, and I'm delighted to be here tonight, and I thank you all for being here too. I want to give special thanks to Andrew Kircher for his programming brilliance, and to, yes, please, which included a bit of 18th century music dedicated to the Duc de Choiseul that you may have heard while you were coming in. And I also want to thank Julie Fuller and her team for making these fabulous 3D models of the Choiseul snuffbox. And her team includes Dabelina, Brenna, Lexi, Anna, and Imogen. And some of those students are depicted in this photo that Julie also staged, which I think is pretty fabulous in dialogue with a 18th century print of snuffbox making from the encyclopédie. So there are people coming around giving you an example of one of these printed snuff boxes. And for those of you who want a little extra something special, there are a few examples that are scented with snuff from an 18th century recipe that you can ask to experience. And I will just briefly, some of you may know this already, but in case you don't, the ritual of snuff box taking was very coded in the 18th century, and it's described in conduct books. It's a kind of polite form of cultural capital showing your social worthiness by being able to perform this ritual. So if you're holding one, or if you're not and you want to kind of mime it, basically you'd have it in your left pocket. You would take it out kind of slowly and strategically. You take the index finger of your right hand, tap it 3 times. Then you would open up the box, and it's the original one was hinged, but we'll just pretend. You would take out a little piece of snuff, a pinch, well, or big, depending on how high you want it to get. You'd put it, actually I'm not sure how you would do this part. You would stick it in the kind of groove here created between your thumb and your index finger, and then you would sniff. And I do have some 18th century snuff that I've sourced from the Isle of Wight. So if there is anyone interested in really leaning into the whole embodied knowledge experience, come talk to me afterwards. Okay. So in 2022, one of the world's most famous snuff boxes was put up for sale. Known as the Choiseul snuff box, or tabatière in French, it was created around 1770 for the Duc de Choiseul, one of France's most powerful government ministers, who served as Director of Foreign Affairs and the Navy, which meant that he controlled France's overseas colonies. The box is celebrated for its exquisite craftsmanship, including its neoclassical gold frame or cage, made by royal goldsmith Louis Roussel, and its intricate miniatures painted on all 6 sides by Louis-Nicolas van Blarenburg, who specialized in these kinds of miniature paintings, but who had also been appointed chief battle painter for the war ministry by Choiseul. These scenes are painted in gouache on vellum, covered with thin sheets of glass, so they kind of look a little bit like slides under a microscope. And they all depict rooms associated with the Duke. 3 of these are from his own private mansion, or hôtel, in Paris, and they're the blue, pink, and green rooms at the top, whereas 2 others show rooms that were accorded to him at Versailles. That's his state bedroom at the bottom left, and his work cabinet in the center, and then the scene at the bottom right shows the Grande Galerie at the Louvre. Choiseul appears in all of these scenes surrounded by friends and members of his administration, who are often one and the same. In the Grande Galerie, for instance, he stands alongside royal engineers and cartographers, some of whom unfurl a large map, whereas others study 3D models of fortified French cities on nearby tables. But perhaps the most famous aspect of this snuff box is the fact that it represents works from Choiseul's famous art collection, which are rendered with such meticulous detail that you can actually identify them. And here on the left, you can see him alongside friends preparing to view some of these works through a monocle. The social pleasures of looking at art are thematized throughout. Choiseul and his wife, Louise Honorine Crozat, had inherited some of these paintings, as well as the mansion in which they are hung, from her great-uncle, Pierre Crozat, one of the most celebrated collectors of the 18th century. But most of the artworks you see had been acquired by Choiseul himself during the late 1750s and 60s. Like many elite French collectors of his day, he was especially partial to Dutch and Flemish landscapes, like the example that you see below, and he was also an early champion of neoclassicism, which rose to prominence in the early 1760s. And here are just a few works that he owned, including paintings by Metsu, Claude Lorrain, Hubert Robert, Vernet, Greuze, and many others. The funds that he used to buy these works came in large part from his wife's inheritance. She was the granddaughter of Antoine Crozat, one of the wealthiest men in France, whose fortune derived from colonial commerce and slave trading, and I'll come back to that later on. The origins of this snuff box are an intriguing mystery, and it doesn't seem to have been commissioned by Choiseul himself. It was probably commissioned by his wife, or his sister, the Duchesse de Clermont, with whom he was extremely close. She appears in a portrait on the snuff box, and is shown in the Duke's cabinet at Versailles, alongside a portrait of Madame de Pompadour, another close female supporter and friend. In 1770, around the time the box was made, the Duke had a major falling out with King Louis XV and was exiled to his country estate at Chanteloup. And there's actually another gold snuff box that's in the collection of the Met that depicts that estate. It's possible that this Louvre tabatière was meant to serve as a kind of spectacular consolation prize for the glorious and powerful life he had lived in the previous decade, and it probably also evoked nostalgia for his art collection, much of which he had to sell off in 1772. The snuff box, however, remained with the Choiseul family until it ended up in England in the early 19th century and was eventually acquired by the Rothschild family. They kept it in their own private collection, which meant that it was rarely seen, adding to its quasi-mystical status, until finally deciding to sell it in 2022. When this impending sale was announced, it immediately became a cause célèbre in France. A committee of experts met to classify the snuff box as a work of, quote, major national heritage interest, as well as a national treasure, which helped launch a massive PR campaign to acquire it for the Louvre. Because of this classification, corporate donors were offered significant tax breaks for contributing to the 3.9 million euro purchase price, 3.9 million euros. And the Louvre itself appealed to any and all patrons, the tout mécènes of the countdown clock and the poster that you see on the screen, who could contribute any amount of money towards the acquisition. Ultimately, this fundraising campaign was successful, and the box entered the Louvre's collection in 2023. Soon after, it became the subject of extensive research carried out by French curators, conservators, and historians who published their findings in a 2024 volume. And you see that the cover of that book on the screen. In the preface, the museum's director, Laurence Descartes, praises the book for giving readers, quote, all of the keys that you still need to unlock the secrets of this highly prized tabatière. This theme of a forensic investigation is carried throughout the volume, which impressively tracks nearly all of the artworks that you see in the box's different rooms and identifies their inhabitants, including friends of the Duke like the Abbé Barthélemy, a famous antiquarian, who you can see on the right. He's actually holding a snuff box and he's dressed in black. And it's interesting to note that the book's subtitle declares it to be a monument of the 18th century. And this was actually a term that was used over and over again in the PR campaign around the box's acquisition, and it helped justify its purchase. So what does this mean that the box is a monument of the 18th century? A monument to what? If you read this book and the press surrounding the acquisition, or if you go to see the box in person, and it's currently on view in the Louvre's Decorative Arts Galleries as part of an exhibition entitled Louvre Couture, which explores the dialogue between fashion and art. You'll hear one recurring explanation of what this means. Basically, that this box is a monument to a highly rarefied form of French taste that was invented by 18th century elites like Choiseul and continues to inspire wealthy art patrons and designers today. In two installation views from the Louvre exhibition, you can see how the box has been placed in a vitrine in the center of an 18th century period room. This room is adjacent to galleries like the one you see on the right, which display 18th century objets d'art, as well as fashion designs by Karl Lagerfeld and others. And the wall label on this vitrine describing the box furthers this connection to fashion and to the couture exhibition by explaining how its interiors inspired Lagerfeld's own decoration of his Parisian hotel. A similar explanation for the box's monument status is offered by a documentary featured Olivier Gabet, the head of the Louvre's Decorative Arts Department, who also organized the Louvre Couture exhibition. As he explains in the film, the snuffbox is a microcosm of 18th century France. C'est la France is the kind of refrain of this film, one that needs to be celebrated for its unmatched elegance and glamour. And the tone is reminiscent of a famous line uttered by Napoleon's chief diplomat, Talleyrand, when he looked nostalgically back on the Ancien Regime and claimed, quote, "He who has not lived in the 18th century before the revolution does not know the sweetness of life." And the Choiseul tabatière in all of these accounts embodies this sweetness. But I think there's another story to be told about this snuffbox and about 18th century French art more generally. One that does not deny or try to, cancel its sweetness, but that looks more critically at how that sweetness is fundamentally entwined with a darker and more complex history. And in taking this approach, I'm inspired by discussion on monuments in France, notably a speech that President Macron gave in June 2020 in the context of debates about their removal or their ruination. And that included this statue of Voltaire in Paris, which was vandalized that same month by protesters who were denouncing Voltaire's involvement in the slave trade. Addressing French citizens from his office in Élysée Palace, an 18th century residence that incidentally was originally financed by Antoine Crozat, Macron avowed that the Republic would not be removing any monuments. Instead, he said, "We must take a clear-sighted look at all our history, all our memories, our relationship with Africa in particular, in order to build a present and a possible future, with a desire for truth and in no way to revisit or deny what we are." So with that directive in mind, I want us to take a closer look at the Choiseul box and think about what other kinds of stories it might tell, especially those related to its patrons' multiple colonial entanglements. At some point, most students of 18th century French art encounter the Choiseul box, whose owner is mainly remembered for his friendship with Pompadour and for his promotion of the Franco-Austrian alliance that eventually led to Marie Antoinette becoming Queen of France. In New York, Choiseul is immortalized in two paintings of ancient and modern Rome by Panini, which he commissioned from the Italian artist when he served as French ambassador to Rome just prior to becoming foreign minister in 1758. He's also known for his world-class art collection and for his support of modern French artists like Hubert Robert. And he's remembered as a great tastemaker, which is how he's principally described in the Louvre volume on the snuffbox. There's no extensive discussion of his government activities, and there's no mention whatsoever of his involvement in colonial affairs. Over the past few years, I've encountered Choiseul and his family network in a different context, as part of a large multimedia project I've been conducting with my colleague Hannah Williams. This project, which we're calling Colonial Networks, explores deep, largely unknown connections between the French colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, and the Paris art world during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Our collaboration was initiated by encounters with 18th century French property maps of Saint-Domingue, like this one on the left, representing the area around the town of Cap Français, now Cap Haitien, where many of the colony's largest and most lucrative sugar plantations were located. On the map, these plantations are identified by the names of their owners, most of whom lived in Paris and managed them from afar. When Hannah and I started looking closely, we were startled to see that its names of plantation owners reads like a who's who of the Paris art world, with many collectors, patrons, dealers, and even artists and architects represented. Though we were vaguely aware of the impact that colonial commerce and enslaved labor had on art in the metropole, these maps made that impact powerfully legible and also deeply disturbing in their pointed claims of ownership over this space. And that's probably why this map was made, so that planters back in Paris could flaunt their ownership over the spaces it depicts. Its trompe-l'oeil frame suggests that it could be hung on a wall, like the map that appears in this portrait of the Comte de Vaudreuil, one of the most important art collectors of the period, who became a courtier in the circle of Marie Antoinette. Vaudreuil is depicted pointing to a different map of Saint-Domingue, where he had grown up because his father had been the colonial governor. The profits from his family's sugar plantations directly funded his art collection, which included portraits by his friend and probable lover Vigie Lebrun, as well as works by Watteau, Boucher, and David, including a replica of the Oath of the Horatii that he commissioned from the artist. The property map I just showed you, which you see here in a close-up detail, is dedicated to Vaudreuil, and one of his family's plantations can be seen in the center, which is kind of on the right here, delineated in light pink with houses for the enslaved indicated. And that's right there. You might also recognize two other familiar names. Vergennes, the government minister who was also a well-known art patron, in the center, and then on the far left, the name Choiseul. This was a plantation not owned by the Duc de Choiseul, but by one of his cousins, Choiseul-Beaupré. And all three of these sites are close to the Breda plantation at the top, where Toussaint Louverture was born and lived. And the Choiseul property later became the site of the Bois Quémont ceremony, which was a 1791 gathering among enslaved laborers that eventually became an important precursor to the Haitian Revolution. I won't go into detail about this project. You can check out the website that I'm shamelessly plugging at the top if you're interested. But I just wanted to say that Hannah and I are currently focusing on two main components, one of which is to track the formation of art collections by Saint-Domingue plantation owners, as well as their dispersal during the French and Haitian revolutions, when they ended up in major museums like the Met, the National Gallery in London, and the Louvre. Another component is to create a critical countermap that aims to turn this colonial map, with its focus on white landowners, against itself and to highlight instead stories of Black life and resistance. And we're collaborating with contemporary Haitian and Caribbean diasporic artists to tell this side of the story and to reimagine individuals and historic events for which there is no surviving visual trace, no portrait like the one of the Comte de Vaudreuil, no snuffbox. And so, for example, for our critical countermap, we would focus not on the Choiseul family's ownership of this plantation or their activities there, but instead on the appropriation, the kind of seizure of this space by Black freedom fighters during the Bois Quémont ceremony. And we'd use an artwork like this mural by the contemporary artist Raphael Barantini, who currently has a show at the Palais de Tokyo, to visualize it. The name Choiseul appears all over property maps of Saint-Domingue. And that makes sense because the Duke's grandfather had governed the colony in its early years, and many of his relatives acquired plantations throughout the 18th century. One of these relatives was the Duc de Choiseul Pralin, with whom our Duke was very close. Throughout the 1760s, the two cousins alternated as France's foreign and navy ministers. So these two cousins, Choiseul and Choiseul Pralin, they were a kind of all-powerful government duo who traded off these really powerful positions of running the navy and of running the foreign ministry. Choiseul Pralin, who you see here, had a plantation in the southern part of Saint-Domingue, near Les Quais, and you can see it encircled in this detail from a different property map, not the one I showed you earlier. And his property was close to an entire kind of swath or series of plantations that were owned by Jean-Joseph de Laborde, another wealthy art patron who was a friend of Choiseul's and was also one of the largest landowners in Saint-Domingue. And he was personally responsible for trafficking more than 10,000 enslaved Africans to the colony. Laborde is very well known for his patronage of Creuse, Hubert Robert, and other French artists. Choiseul Pralin is less well known, but he too had a huge art collection. So these are just a few examples of works that Choiseul Pralin owned, and you can also see an image of his bed, which is at the map. So during the 1760s, as he and his cousin enacted policies to spur the growth of Saint-Domingue, Choiseul persuaded the king to grant him lucrative land concessions, which made him the owner of the 3 main islands off Haiti's coast. And you can see them circled in red here. And I'm also showing you a detail of one of these concessions that's signed by Louis XV. And I can't help but show you this image of Choiseul-Pralin's briefcase, which is amazingly in the Met's collection, and it dates to this very same period. And it really makes you think about the papers that were in it. These 3 islands that he ended up owning were rich in timber that could be used to build plantations, as well as ships. And Choiseul-Pralin saw an opportunity to expand his already huge fortune. In 1785, he sold one of these islands and its enslaved labor force to a developer for the princely sum of 350,000 livres, at the same time that he was expanding his art collection. So the main point I want to make is that the Choiseul family was dominant in Saint-Domingue and in other French possessions in the Americas, including Martinique, where another branch of the family were military and colonial administrators. And this dominance enabled the material splendor they enjoyed in the metropole. These benefits continued long after the Haitian Revolution, and in 1825, when France forced the new Haitian government to pay indemnities to its former colonizers, scores of Choiseul family members made indemnity claims. And you can see these in 2 screenshots that I made from a database called Repère that tracks these claims. And these were based on the claims of ownership of property, and that included enslaved laborers. So this year, 2025, marks the 200-year anniversary of these devastating indemnities. And you might have seen in the New York Times just last week that the French government has finally officially acknowledged their devastating effects and has formed a commission to study them. Now, the Duc de Choiseul was not directly linked to the plantations that are listed here, but as I mentioned earlier, much of his fortune, along with the Parisian mansion that's depicted on his snuffbox, came from the inheritance of his wife, the granddaughter of Antoine Crozat. Around the turn of the 18th century, Crozat had been a founding director of the Saint-Domingue and Guinea companies, which had been in charge of developing the colony and providing enslaved laborers. And he'd also been a partner in the first tobacco monopoly, established by Louis XIV, which was another source of his family's wealth. Tobacco, as you know, was a stimulant first used by indigenous populations before it became a huge early driver of European colonial expansion and enslavement in the Americas. It also became a transformative element of European consumer culture, and it generated an entire industry of luxury goods related to its consumption, like the Choiseul tabatière. Although it's possible that the Choiseul snuff box was considered too precious to actually contain snuff, it's still surprising that its connections to tobacco are not mentioned anywhere in the Louvre volume, especially given the family ties to this colonial commodity. The volume, in fact, doesn't mention any colonial commodities that are relevant to this snuff box, the most obvious one being gold, but also indigo and cochineal, which likely provided the blue and pink dyes used for the wall hangings of 2 of its rooms, as well as exotic hardwoods like mahogany and rosewood, which were used for some of its furnishings and its striking parquet floors. And I'll come back to those floors. The Duc de Choiseul was actively seeking ways to increase the production of these commodities throughout the 1760s as a way to rebuild the post-war French economy, and we can almost see his house as a kind of advertisement for the wealth and splendor that they could generate. The desire for gold and the quest to find the mythical El Dorado had also been a major early driver of European exploration and exploitation of the Americas. It was the main reason why Antoine Crozat, in the early 18th century, secured a monopoly on trade in French colonial Louisiana, although his hopes of finding gold there were dashed. In this period, gold was mined mainly by enslaved African and Amerindian laborers in Portuguese Brazil, but the French held out hopes of finding El Dorado, which makes a prominent appearance in Voltaire's best-selling novel Candide from 1759. Voltaire, who was a close friend of the Duc de Choiseul, describes this mythical city as a pure utopia, filled with children who play with large chunks of gold and gemstones as large as those in the Mughal emperor's throne. The walls of its homes, he claimed, were paneled in gold, and the streets smelled like sweet cloves and cinnamon, so if you stick your nose in one of those scented snuff boxes, you can imagine being transported there. Like many early modern cartographers, Voltaire conflates El Dorado with Guyana, a territory in South America adjacent to Brazil that had been colonized by France, Britain, and the Netherlands. And this link to gold was definitely one reason why Choiseul launched a massive colonization campaign to Guyana in 1763, which I'll get to in just a minute. But before I do, I just want to say that these links between the material splendor of the 18th century art of living, as embodied by the Choiseul snuffbox, and colonial violence were not at all hidden or disavowed in this period, but were widely not acknowledged and plainly visible. It's really more our own period eyes that sometimes has trouble seeing them. Slavery and the culture of taste, as Simon Gikandi has described in his pioneering study, were ghostly doubles that were structurally dependent on each other in deep and disturbing ways, not just economically, but conceptually as well. Sometimes this connection was made quite explicit, as in these examples of English snuff boxes depicting enslaved Africans wearing metal collars, who perform a kind of double semiotic duty. They reference both the brutal forced labor required to produce tobacco, but also its transformation into a polite commodity used by European elites to demonstrate their social worthiness. And many of the enslaved attendants that lived in these Parisian mansions in this period also had to fulfill this kind of duty. Links between gold, enslaved labor, and the Americas were also sometimes made explicit. For example, in this trade card for a Parisian goldsmith shop named the Tête Noire, which portrays the bust of a Black woman whose costume and pose evoke the common 18th century portrait type of white sitters with enslaved attendants, including this one of the great aunt of the Duchesse de Choiseul. Real-life enslaved individuals were also a pervasive presence in Parisian households during this period, including those inhabited by members of the Choiseul family. These were often young men or boys taken from the colonies to serve these households, despite official restrictions against bringing them to metropolitan France. Colonists got around these restrictions either through high-level government connections, like maybe your cousin was a foreign minister, or by claiming that they were training enslaved servants in a métier, like wig making or sugar sculpting, that they could practice back in the colonies. Such individuals regularly appear, often wearing exotic turbans and court livery, in images of Parisian mansions, like this view of the Hôtel Télusson, built by the French architect Ledoux for the widow of a financier involved in the slave trade. And you can also see them in portraits by the artist Cormontel, who depicted some of the young men forced to labor for the Chat Orléans family at the Palais Royal, near the Hôtel Choiseul. It was, in fact, the Duc de Choiseul, in his capacity as foreign minister and director of French colonial policy, who in the early 1760s tried to definitively forbid the entry of all enslaved and free people of color into metropolitan France, and to expel those who were currently living there. Part of the reason for this was a perceived shortage of enslaved labor in France's Caribbean colonies, owing to the 7 Years' War. But in a missive that he sent out to all metropolitan and colonial administrators in 1763, Choiseul wrote of the need to, quote, put an end to the disorders that they, meaning the enslaved, have introduced in the kingdom by their communication with the whites, from which has resulted in a mixed blood that increases daily. One wonders whether these stated fears of miscegenation and fantasy of white purity could have shaped Choiseul's appreciation for neoclassicism, specifically artworks that he owned, like Vian's image of a Greek bather with an enslaved attendant, which was shown to great acclaim at the Salon of 1763, the same year he issued this order, or this white marble statue of Innocence that was also in his collection. I don't think it's a coincidence that neoclassicism, and more specifically images of virginal white female bodies, began to proliferate on the walls of the Paris Salon and in the homes of collectors during this decade, which simultaneously witnessed the explosive growth of Saint-Domingue's plantation economy at a scale that paralleled the explosive growth of the Paris art market, as well as the rise of racist rhetoric used to justify enslavement. I think it's also important to examine the shift from the Rococo to neoclassicism around 1760 against this broader colonial context, not only because attacks against the Rococo used this same language of miscegenation, claiming, for instance, that it was a monstrous hybrid style that tried to combine things that didn't belong together, but also because the very same people who were writing these critiques and championing neoclassicism were personally tied to colonial development. Choiseul, for one, but also the Comte de Caylus, whose brother was the colonial governor of Martinique and Guadeloupe, and who had given him an enslaved servant who lived with him for 20 years in Paris. In the end, Choiseul's deportation policy was never implemented, and among those who continued to house slaves in Paris during this period were his Saint-Domingue cousins, who lived near the Bourse du Commerce and on the Rue de Cherche-Midi. One of these cousins is recorded as owning an enslaved African man named Telemachus, while another is cited as purchasing a man named Sertorius, who's named after the ancient Roman general, in 1772. This particular purchase happened not in the colonies, as one might expect, but in Paris, in the office of a Parisian notary, and the price negotiated was 2,000 livres. This sale occurred just 2 weeks before the Duc de Choiseul's highly publicized sale of his art collection, where his friend, the plantation owner and enslaver Laborde, bought the painting on the right for the same price of 2,000 livres. And Laborde actually ended up buying more than half of Choiseul's collection to help get his friend out of debt, and then he later flipped and resold the works for a profit. I'm certainly not trying to conflate these two acquisitions, but I do want to make the point that they were conflated in the 18th century as two forms of property and of cultural capital that were sold via the same networks and systems of exchange in a way that raises really disturbing questions about value and also about aesthetics, especially the aesthetics of neoclassicism. One also wonders about the perverse decision to give so many enslaved individuals classical names like Sertorius or Telemachus, which reflect the protagonists of the neoclassical artworks their enslavers collected. It suggests that we should maybe rethink or at least nuance the conventional association between French neoclassicism and the paintings of David in particular with ideas of enlightenment, freedom, and reform, and acknowledge that many 18th century art patrons and antiquarians saw these works differently, and they looked to the slaveholding societies of ancient Greece and Rome as a model and a justification for their own practices. Their views on slavery as an essential, even benign institution in antiquity were influenced by Choiseul's friend, the Abbé Barthélemy, whom we've already seen on the snuffbox. His best-selling novel, The Voyage of the Young Anacharsis, was beloved by Thomas Jefferson, among others, and his writings inspired the Duke's cousin, Choiseul Gouffier, who was another famed antiquarian, to publish an illustrated travel account of Greece and to collect antiquities during his time there. And Choiseul Gouffier also had another, more insidious reason for making this first trip to Greece in 1776. He was escaping Paris, where his enslaved servant, a Senegalese man whom he had named Hercules, had sued him for abuse. This man, Hercules, had previously been enslaved in French Guiana, and he was brought to Paris by one of the Duc de Choiseul's colonial officials. In 1763, after France lost Canada and other possessions to the British during the 7 Years' War, Guyana was the only French colony left in the continental Americas, and it was also one of France's earliest colonial settlements. And Guyana, as you may know, is still classified as an overseas département in France, and it's where the country's space program is headquartered. So, the next colonial frontier. Previous attempts to develop the colony had never been successful, partly because its swampy lands were so resistant to agricultural development. And by the mid-18th century, Guyana's capital, Cayenne, was so deserted that one visitor claimed you could kill a person in broad daylight without being seen. And yet, inspired by Voltaire's description of Guyana as a new El Dorado, Choiseul decided that he would go where no king had gone before and make it a successful colony, one that could serve both as a military base and as a breadbasket for France's other Caribbean possessions, notably Saint-Domingue, and in this way it could compensate on some level for the loss of Canada. Choiseul believed that Guyana could be used to grow not only colonial commodities, but also agricultural food staples that would limit the need to ship them from France. He was inspired by physiocratic thinking of his day, especially the writings of the Comte de Mirabeau, whose own interest in applying agrarian theories to colonial development were inspired by his brother's tenure as governor of Guadeloupe. Choiseul was also inspired by a plantation owner from Guyana named Préfontaine, who came to Paris in 1762 to sell the Duke on a development scheme. He dedicated a treatise to Choiseul called Maison Rustique, which looked back to French agronomic manuals of the 16th and 17th centuries, while also evoking period images of the ancient villas of Pliny the Younger. Préfontaine argued that a new class of powerful white landowners could build beautiful plantations in Guyana, and one of the fold-out plans included in his treatise depicted his own property alongside an aerial view of a model plantation that a prospective colonist could build, surrounded by formal French gardens and houses for enslaved laborers that were separated from the main house by a creek. So this plan, which looks a bit like the map that Choiseul and his surveyors are unfurling in the snuffbox scene of the Grande Galerie, professes a fantasy of order and containment that belied the disorder, both of land and of enslaved populations, that had long characterized Guyana, something Préfontaine himself was well aware of because he worked as a hunter of maroons, or enslaved laborers who escaped plantations. Still, his scheme convinced Choiseul, who hatched a plan for a massive new colonial settlement in Guyana near the Kourou River, an area that was purported to be extremely fertile and filled with gold. And that's exactly the site where the space program is now. In his first official act related to the colony, Choiseul granted himself and Choiseul Pralin, his cousin, ownership over the largest area of land in this new colony, which extended all the way from the Kourou River to the border of Dutch Guiana or Suriname, and he made it a hereditary fiefdom that carried naming, hunting, and fishing rights. He then appointed acolytes, including the botanist Turgot, brother of the more famous economist, to run the operation, which departed from Préfontaine's vision in two key ways. First, Choiseul determined that Guyana had to be an all-white colony. Tout en blanc was the phrase that he used. Because, as he wrote to Turgot, he believed that recent British conquests during the 7 Years' War, quote, had been made possible by their northern colonies, which are almost entirely populated by whites. And he claimed that white peasants working as indentured servants for a few powerful lords or landowners would make better farmers and more loyal soldiers willing to defend the colony. Several royal engineers around this time had tried to deal with this problem of soldier desertion in the American colonies, particularly among enslaved men who joined black regiments, and one had proposed this stunning design for a tower or a fortress that would house enslaved men who would be forced to fight enemy combatants without being able to escape. But Choiseul rejected this plan, and he clung to his insistence on Guyana being all white, not because he was against plantation slavery, he was working at the same time to expand it in Saint-Domingue and elsewhere, but because he believed in the supremacy of the white race, and he saw Guyana as a kind of tabula rasa testing ground. Another issue his administration faced was getting enough white women, identified in colonial documents as virtuous, childbearing women, to settle in the colony, and he solicited various ideas, including one that proposed sending young female orphans there, who could work in an appropriate capacity until they turned 18, whereupon they would be married off to white peasants whose lord or seigneur would supply a dowry. And this had the double advantages of preventing mixed-race unions and of making the colony self-reproducing, which was something that administrators were concerned with. So there's no image that accompanies this proposal, which is in the same set of documents as this fortress design, but the contemporaneous painting it most readily evokes is Greuze's Village Bride, which received rapturous praise at the Salon of 1761, as well as many images of virginal white women that Choiseul himself was collecting in this decade. And all of the works to the right are works that he acquired during this period, including Greuze's young woman praying at the altar of love, and they're all depicted on his snuffbox. Art historians have connected the Village Bride, which Diderot famously claimed preaches population, to physiocratic theory, but really only in a domestic context. And I think it's also important to consider its colonial associations, which were very much a part of physiocratic discourse and which were really visible at the time, even to Diderot himself, who was so excited by Choiseul's vision for Guyana that he sent his nephew there. Choiseul's colonization campaign also differed from Préfontaine's in terms of scale. It was far and away the largest effort of its kind during the entire Ancien regime. Ultimately, more than 15,000 Europeans, most of them German-speaking peasants, migrants, and refugees from the Alsace and Rhine regions whose territories had been devastated by the war, were shipped off to Guyana between 1763 and 65, a period that coincided with the height of Choiseul's art buying. They were joined by Acadian refugees from former French Canada, who had been flooding metropolitan ports, as well as Protestants imprisoned on the galleys in Marseille, whom Voltaire had helped persuade to join the group. Just to give you a sense of numbers, the entire population of New York City in this period was less than 20,000, and only about 15,000 people immigrated to Canada over the entire 18th century, and this was something that happened in less than 2 years. Some colonists seem to have been coerced into making the trip, but many others dreamed of gold, or at least the better life that was promised to them by Choiseul's propaganda machine. French officials circulated placards throughout the Alsace and Rhine regions, assuring potential colonists that the crown would pay for their voyage and provide them and their families with beautiful land, food, clothing, and housing for 2.5 years. Archival documents indicate that these placards were translated into German and were accompanied by maps that were, quote, engraved in wood in the German manner. French maps of Guyana had long represented the colony and its island capital of Cayenne as an Edenic, fertile territory that looked a lot like the island of Utopia from Thomas More's famous text. Inscriptions on these maps perpetuated the fantasy of Guyana as El Dorado and offered, on a formal level, both a fantasy of seemingly infinite access, with waterways running like open veins through the territory, and the assurance of control and protection, insofar as French ships frequently surround the space and defensive forts are usually depicted. The visual language of Utopia, specifically the meandering ribbon of water that kind of leads off into nowhere, is also present in the optical views that were created for this Guyana campaign, which were made by the same royal engineers who produced maps promoting colonization around 1763. And the same cartographer who made this map at the bottom, for instance, which is 1763 map, also designed the optical view that's just above it. So these images, which, as I'm sure you've probably realized, look nothing like Guyana then or now, were designed to be seen through a proto-cinematic device called a zogroscope that gave the illusion of 3 dimensions and a fantasy of transport without ever having to leave the confines of home. And this is what a zogroscope looks like. A friend who's demonstrating. We tried to actually make a modern version of a zogroscope. It didn't work, but I have an 18th century version of this optical print that you can look at the end of the lecture, if you like. These images aim to immerse viewers in a quasi-mythical realm that evokes Watteau's island of Cythera, while it also strongly resembles the Dutch and Flemish landscapes that Choiseul collected, as well as paintings by Vernet and Lorrain that he owned. French engineers may have made their images look like Dutch landscapes because they were being instructed to imitate the Dutch and try to figure out how to make the swampy landscape of Guyana productive, which required empoldering to control flooding, and that's something that the French didn't figure out in reality for a really long time. But it's more likely, however, that these images were inspired by what Sarah Mallory has described as an impulse for creating paper utopias within the Dutch landscape tradition. Landscapes that freely conflate history and myth, and that enabled European colonizers to shape a vision of the world as they wanted and needed it to be. Paper utopias also abound in a promotional text for Guyana that was dedicated to Choiseul and published in 1763, written by royal geographer Jacques Bellin. It repeatedly assured readers that Guyana was a lush territory filled with welcoming native inhabitants, prodigious flora and fauna, and very little disease, which was totally untrue. It would be quite easy, Bellin surmised, for settlers to make their fortunes by cultivating tobacco, cotton, coffee, indigo, and cochineal. And he added that many valuable tropical hardwoods grew in Guyana, particularly mahogany and rosewood that were prized for furnishings. All of these products, as I've already mentioned, are represented on the Choiseul snuffbox, including its unusual parquet floors, which are made of rosewood that almost certainly came from Guyana, and that may have been part of samples that Choiseul Praslin had shipped from the colony. These floors were so rare and precious that when they were sold by the family in 1786, they had their own separate section in the sale catalog. To my mind, their circular radiating designs recall the compass roses that appear on French maps of Guyana, and they reinforce a vision of this box as offering the chance to hold the entire world in the palm of your hand. Like the marble maps that decorated the floors of Amsterdam City Hall in the 17th century, they encouraged a sense of domination and potentially limitless access that's also suggested by the infinite perspective view of the Grande Galerie. But these rooms also reveal an interesting tension between expansion and constriction, because they're also closed-off forts, barricading white inhabitants from the supposed disorder caused by enslaved non-white populations, and enabling them to maintain a myth of insular distinctiveness. Disorder turned out to be a defining characteristic of the Guyana campaign, which was an unmitigated disaster. The monarchy was utterly unprepared for the massive influx of colonists who flooded Rochefort, the port of debarkation for Guyana, on France's Atlantic coast, which quickly devolved into a nightmare of overcrowding, filth, starvation, and disease. Rochefort had been one of the jewels of the crown of the Royal Navy under Louis XIV, but it had already experienced problems with disorder in the waning years of the 7 Years' War, as refugees and war wounded flooded the port. None of this is visible, however, in Vernet's painting, part of his state-sponsored port series that he completed in 1762. By the time Vernet publicly exhibited this work at the Salon of 1763, signs of death and disaster related to the Guyana campaign were readily apparent, although they're obfuscated in the artist's harmonious vision, where laborers and possibly prospective colonists cheerfully unload goods, drink wine, smoke tobacco, play cards, and tote babies, while a group of well-dressed men in the foreground talk business or maybe plot a future conquest. Connections to colonization are subtle, although look more closely and you'll see an enslaved child trailing behind a group of elites. And you can also see a line of transatlantic ships being readied in the background, next to the large warehouse used for storing colonial goods, which is also mentioned in the painting's title. It looks like a ship is on fire in the background, but it's actually being repaired. And overall, this is an assertion of rebirth and renewal, the 18th century equivalent of Monet's Impression Sunrise, not the illusory calm before the storm that had already befallen Rochefort. In his review of Vernet's port series at the Salon, Diderot praised the artist's boundless creative capacities, likening him to an ancient god or to a colonial administrator who, quote, populates his canvas as one populates a colony. It's hard to imagine a more accurate or more devastating description of how Choiseul and his administration approached Guyana, or how art could fuel the colonial imaginary with tragic results. In planning the Guyana campaign, the Crown had characteristically privileged style over substance. They sent troops of musicians and circus performers to entertain the colonists, but not enough food. And the governor Turgot transported 14 bespoke water buffaloes from Italy to help with cultivation, without ever figuring out what was actually needed to facilitate agricultural development. And they also didn't know how to harness these buffaloes, so it didn't work. Choiseul was more concerned with securing the best tracts of land for himself and for his family than with ensuring that there was sufficient housing for anyone else. In the end, the vast majority of settlers, around 13,000, ended up dying of starvation and disease. And again, for scale, 13,000 is the full number of people who were guillotined during the French Revolution. And another 2,000 or so died before they ever left the cesspool that had become Rochefort. Turgot, the nominal governor, did not even arrive in Guyana until December of 1764, when things had already fallen apart and descended into chaos. And he had no way to describe the horror show he witnessed upon arrival, except in artistic terms. In a letter to Choiseul, he wrote of how he saw himself surrounded, quote, by a multitude of emaciated and pale widows and orphans of both sexes, bathed in tears, who clasped their hands and raised their eyes towards heaven. Art in this instance did not only visualize or engender colonial fantasies, but when that fantasy turned into a nightmare, it helped process the trauma from a safe aesthetic remove. Although there was an official inquiry into the disaster, only one administrator was imprisoned, and others failed upwards into even more prestigious posts. Turgot spent 2 years trying to assume ownership of those 14 Italian water buffaloes on the grounds that he had personally paid for their acquisition. And in one of the letters related to this request, even Choiseul Palin, upon reviewing this claim, crossed it out and wrote in the margins, "This is indecent." In May 1765, as the scale of the tragedy was becoming known in Paris, Voltaire wrote to Choiseul, fretting that he would, quote, be taken for a romancer if the colony does not succeed, because in the end it is the land of Candide. In response, Choiseul admitted that Guyana was a fantasy, that's the word he used, but he continued to defend his plan, saying that he'd sent all of his most excellent people and he didn't understand what went wrong. And in the end, he blamed everyone but himself. Both men emerged relatively unscathed. Choiseul's exile in 1770 was not related to Guyana. And within a decade, a new campaign was launched to settle the colony, this time with an enslaved workforce. Perhaps one of the reasons why memory of this tragedy has faded so quickly was that so many of the Guyana documents were allegedly burned or destroyed. And I can't help but look at the charred letters in the fireplace of one of the snuffbox's rooms and think about this cover-up. Within a few months, Choiseul had brushed off the scandal and returned both to imperial plotting and to art buying. In 1767, he acquired these two paintings from the sale of another preeminent collector, later reselling them for unheard-of sums to Louis XVI and Catherine the Great. Both paintings, to my mind, serve as haunting reminders of the Guyana campaign, and they evoke Diderot's statement about canvas as colony, or in this case, colony as canvas. Safe in the fortress of his Parisian hotel, Choiseul was able to surround himself with visual fantasies of a peaceful, productive, all-white colony that looked much better than anything he could ever enact on the ground. So to conclude, in all of the recent literature on the snuffbox, Choiseul's colonial connections are never discussed, and he himself is presented as a national hero, a great patron of the arts, and at worst, a bit of a court schemer who stirred up a lot of drama among royal women like Madame du Barry and Marie Antoinette. So as I said, I'm not trying to have him or Voltaire or anyone else canceled. In fact, it's quite the contrary. I think if we return to the display of this snuff box at the Louvre, it seems to me that this could be an extraordinary opportunity to bring in some of this context and complexity to explore the ghostly double in the mirror, as it were. And this approach wouldn't negate the beauty or the value of this monument object, but it would acknowledge that beautiful works of art can have difficult, ugly histories, and that there's a kind of different beauty in that. As I mentioned, the box is part of the Louvre Couture show, installed in the Decorative Arts Galleries, and it's alone in an 18th century period room furnished with cabinets containing scientific instruments, including tools like graphometers and plane tables that were used by royal surveyors to map colonial territories in the period, as well as pocket globes. And what is this snuff box if not a pocket globe? It wouldn't be hard to fill these shelves with samples of colonial materials like indigo and cochineal, or objects made from them, and perhaps also a few maps and optical views associated with Guyana and other territories overseen by Choiseul, whereas artworks from his collection that are now in the Louvre could adorn the opposite wall. This would be fitting on many levels, since I did a bit of digging, and it turns out that the gilded paneling in this room is taken from an 18th century Parisian residence that belonged to a principal investor in the French Guiana Company, which sought to finance a new colonization campaign to Guyana in the 1770s. And they were also given exclusive rights to finance slave trading in the region. And on the right is a portrait of this investor's wife, which is also at the Louvre, although the family's ties to this campaign aren't mentioned in the galleries or anywhere on the website. In my own fantasy for this new display, the Choiseul box could stay right where it is, but it would become the fulcrum of a rapidly turning world, not an object that, as the Louvre would seem to have it, stands still or is frozen in time. Its story could extend outward and be expansive rather than restrictive, multi-layered rather than one-dimensional. Surely some museum goers who remain partial to the myth of the 18th century's untroubled sweetness would not appreciate this reframing, but I think it would draw in many new audiences, in addition to challenging the status quo. In the hour or so I spent in this gallery a few weeks ago, I noticed very few people pausing to look at the snuff box, and many didn't even enter the gallery once they realized that its vitrine contained no purse by Lagerfeld or shoes by Louboutin. And that's a shame, because I do believe that this tiny monument merits a much longer, deeper, and closer look. Thank you.
We have time for questions, and also the students will come through to collect those boxes.
My first job was actually as an auctioneer, so if it would benefit the Iris Foundation, we could auction a few. But does anyone have any questions or comments?
Thank you for this lecture. You mentioned that the enslaved man sued him for abuse. How amazed that he was permitted to sue, that he had legal recourse. How did that work out?
So there's a great book by Sue Peabody, the historian, called There Are No Slaves in France, this was a kind of edict from, much earlier in the Ancien Regime that theoretically prevented, I'm sorry, I can't actually see who asked the question. Can you raise your hands?
Right here.
That theoretically prevented enslaved people from coming to the metropole, but there were that didn't really exist in reality. And there were all sorts of restrictions. But what it did mean is that sometimes enslaved people were able to go to the courts and try to claim their freedom or to bring charges against their enslavers. And that's one of the reasons why we actually have some surviving traces of these individuals in archival documentation. Otherwise they would kind of, vanish without a trace. He went actually, Hercules, went up to the kind of main floor of the judiciary and made this claim. And he technically won his manumission, but he was captured. I can't remember the exact details of the story. It's definitely in the Peabody book. He was essentially re-enslaved and sent to Saint-Domingue. So it was a very brief blip of freedom, if you could even call it that. Jeffrey?
So Meredith, I'm wondering, in that map of Santo Domingo, there was the reference to Milord and to English people. So were there British investors as well?
Yes, I mean, I think, part of like my work in general, but this project in particular is really challenging the whole idea of French art, in terms of its metropolitan focus and reorienting the geography, but also even thinking about sort of colonies themselves as being exclusively French. I mean, I've referred to that as Saint-Domingue as a French colony throughout because it predominantly was. But you did have many Irish, in fact, but also some English plantation owners there, and some of them lived in metropolitan France and were associated with slave trading businesses in Nantes or Bordeaux, or Le Havre, actually, especially after the 7 Years' War. So you did have plantation owner. You didn't necessarily have to be a French subject to own a plantation there. Probably. I haven't really looked specifically at that, but I think you have, what's happening top down with the administration, and then what's happening kind of, the colonists themselves. This was part of Choiseul's fear, is that it wasn't only soldiers who were deserting during the war, it was colonists themselves. When British troops arrived in Martinique, many colonists were like, whoever's going to manage this better, I'm open to it. It's capitalism. Let's just figure out who's going to do this best. So there was a whole kind of, that was part of the problem too.
So thank you, Meredith, for a brilliant lecture. And you clearly open and you're writing a new part of 18th century studies, and you're looking at new material. And there's generation of French and American also curators and specialists of 18th century French art who have looked at this object and are not telling these stories, and you were very clear in mentioning that. So I would be interested to know more about your sources. What kind of documents you have been looking at? Where did you find them? And obviously, you need a brilliant mind like yours to put all of this in connection together. But what were your main sources? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'd say, to be fair, like I wasn't really looking at these sources, telling this story either 15 years ago. I mean, I think it's part of a broader kind of recognition that's, fueled by a lot of different things, including current political events. But my work has always been very, very deeply archival. I was just maybe looking at different archives, like when I was writing this book about Marie Antoinette, royal building records, although certainly references to enslaved individuals, including a young Senegalese boy named Jean Amilcar, who was given to Marie Antoinette. They're in those archives. I just didn't see them, like you have to sort of see something and then you kind of can't stop seeing it. For this project, part of it is just looking at artworks that I've been looking at for a really long time in a new way, so it's not so much that, Vien, for instance, Vernet, Creuse even, reading a lot about the kind of colonial dimensions of French physiocracy. That's something that historians have really brought to the picture. And art historians have been, we're advanced in some ways, but we're a little bit late to the table in other ways. And so I read a lot of like secondary sources by historians, and then a lot of archival documents that are related to the Navy, to the Foreign Ministry. Some of this is from the book working on galleys and galley slavery in Marseille. There's a huge, there's a lot of colonial documentation related to Guyana, and a lot of them have these illustrations, which I don't really think have been studied so much by art historians. And I think Guyana itself hasn't really been so much of a focus of art historical inquiry, although hopefully maybe that will change a bit.
Oh, thank you, Meredith. I also want to add my thanks for opening our eyes to all sorts of things that have been under our eyes but invisible. And I wanted just to pick up on Charlotte's question, although I think you may have started an answer to it. In terms of your final kind of call to arms, how can museums mobilize this material in new and different and maybe more interesting ways? You've definitely shown us that the Louvre has kind of lost an opportunity in this moment. But I was thinking that...
Well, they still have it.
Well, no, but in this installation. I was thinking that, other museums in France have not shied away from this at all. And the Musée du Nouveau Monde in La Rochelle, and I was just in Nantes, where the museum, absolutely uses very similar objects to tell quite different stories. And I was wondering, why isn't Paris doing that? And then it occurs to me, tell me if you agree, that it has more perhaps to do with the type of museum. I was realizing that those museums I mentioned are not art museums, they are history museums, they are local museums. So what would be your prescription for, in a sense, reorienting an institution like the Louvre to tell more and broader stories? Is it a matter of collaborating with other kinds of institutions in France? Is it a matter of looking to their own Atlantic coast to learn the stories that they're not telling? Or what's your thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think there's a kind of tale of two museums in Paris right now. I mean, you have even like the Quai Branly, the Palais de Tokyo, which has Raphael Berentini's show. You know, there's definitely exhibitions devoted to this topic in certain parts of Paris. And it's not, you know, I was thinking like, well, maybe it's the Réunion des Musées Nationaux, the national museums like the Louvre, but the Centre des Monuments Nationaux, the Center for National Monuments, collaborated with the Foundation for the Memory of Slavery to install an exhibition on enslaved freedom fighters during the French and Haitian revolutions in the crypt of the Pantheon. You know, and there's no more kind of like national monument than the Pantheon. And actually, Raphael Berentini also had an installation in the main part of the monument. So things are kind of happening and changing, but I do think there's a difference. You know, there's still a lot of silence on this subject in Paris. There's the monument to the, you know, sort of memory of enslaved individuals that has been stalled now for like 5 or 6 years. It's supposed to open, but I don't know when. Whereas museums in port cities, you know, especially cities which had these really strong ties to the transatlantic slave trade, have kind of taken the lead. The Nantes L'Abîme exhibition, La Rochelle, Le Havre, museums in Normandy also did a whole series of exhibitions related to this. So I think things are definitely changing.
Any other questions? Deborah.
Thank you, Meredith. I have a wonderful lecture. I have a very different kind of question, and that is, do we know anything about who made this box, and whether could there have been other ones at some point, and if not, why would everyone not want their own and commission one
You mean
from
similar kinds of boxes with their
Yeah.
art collection? And
yeah
yeah, I mean, there's so that, I mean, something that the Louvre volume really does well is kind of tries to trace not all of the archival documents, because as I said, there's other sources and archival documents that you can look to, but documents related to the inventories of the family to see sort of who might have commissioned this object, like where it ended up. And, you know, as I mentioned, it probably was commissioned by his wife or maybe by his sister, you know, from Louis Nicolas van Blarenberg, who did make other snuff boxes, some for Choiseul. He made the one of Chanteloup that's in the Met. And then Louis Roussel, who was a goldsmith, actually of German origin. So it's a kind of another story about refugees from these German-speaking lands who then come and are involved in a whole like flowering of artisanal production in Paris. Who Roussel was also, you know, collaborated or was involved in designing many other stuff boxes of the period. But I think, you know, Choiseul was exiled for a period of time. I mean, you know, it's hard to separate the fact from the myth. There's this kind of myth of like this magical box that was, you know, created, kind of popped up out of nowhere, and then it, you know, ended up in England. And so I don't, you know, maybe it wasn't all that widely known except among his circle of friends during his exile, you know, friends who would come to visit him. And perhaps that's not why it didn't spawn a huge fashion. I mean, it's also incredibly, you know, difficult to produce, probably very, very expensive. So that could also explain. It's a bit of a one-off.
Great. Any other questions?
Can I say one thing really quickly, that just to respond to Charlotte's? I wanted to tell people that if you would like to, you know more, a little bit more about the kind of identities and lives of enslaved individuals who were in the metropole in the 18th century, there's a really wonderful source by Eric Noël, who's a professor at the University of the Antilles, called Dictionnaire des gens de couleur, which transcribes all of the archival documentation related to these individuals. And it's probably a vast undercount, but there's also a historian who is publishing a book called Slaves in Paris that's going to come out next month. Her name is Miranda Spieler, and she and I are collaborating on a digital map that documents the presence of enslaved individuals in Paris right at this period that hopefully we're going to have this summer. But I would really look at Eric Noël's volume. That's one archival source that has been really useful.
I noticed that in the photo there's a info panel. What's the info that's presented about
I
the?
was gonna put show a detail of it, and then I was like, oh my god, there's so much going on in this talk, and if you have to read this placard, it basically says that this was made for the Duc de Choiseul, in this time period, and it shows the Duke and his friends, and they're dressed in very fashionable outfits, and it inspired Karl Lagerfeld to design his own interiors. And it's partly because it's a carton, it's a wall label that's specifically meant to be connected to the Louvre Couture show. I assume they'll rewrite it after that. If they're going to keep, it's really fragile, so are they going to keep it on view? I'm not sure they will. But maybe there'll be a kind of digital possibility. Yeah.
Well, please join me in thanking Meredith Martin.